With the wild card round of the 2024 AFC playoffs in the books, let's talk about the what-ifs and lessons learned after watching a weekend of disappointing games.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We are Locked On Bengals on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Welcome back to all of you that make Locked On Bengals part of your everyday routine, especially those of you who make us your first listen. We appreciate all of you who don't miss an episode more than we can say, and welcome into everyone who is listening or watching Locked On Bengals for the first time. If you're doing that and you're looking to stay up to date on all things Bengals throughout this DC search and this crucial offseason that will be pivotal with all the money the Bengals have to spend in a very important draft, as they all are coming up, well, you're in the right place and you can subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime, where you can save $20 on your first purchase of tickets using promo code LOCKEDONNFL. James, let's dive into the wild card weekend that was. We saw disappointing, lopsided games throughout the AFC. We saw the Bills blow out the Broncos, the Ravens in a game that wasn't close against the Steelers, who backed into the playoffs, and the Texans, and probably the biggest surprise of the weekend with a very lopsided victory over the Chargers, in which Justin Herbert had a terrible game. And watching those games, it was hard not to think about, the Bengals had a chance to do some damage here if they had just gotten in.
Yeah, the Bengals are probably, if flaws and all, I think they're the fourth best team in the AFC. I really do. I think they're better than the Steelers. I think they're certainly better than the Chargers, even though they lost to the Chargers. They beat the Steelers, so Pittsburgh fans go argue with the wall, beat them last week. And they were able to handle business against the Broncos. And don't try to sell me on the Texans. I mean, Jake Liscow at quarterback probably beats the Houston Texans. They were left for dead in that first half. It was awful. They were dreadful. And everyone remembers the end after 4 interceptions and that last drive where Joe Mixon's running the ball. The Houston Texans stink. And so lucky Kansas City gets to play Houston. And Rex Ryan called that a bye for the Chargers. I think it's a bye for the Chiefs this week. Hopefully the Texans prove me wrong. I don't expect that. So I think 4 of those 7 teams are pretty, not just flawed, but kind of bad. And it's certainly something that I think a lot of Bengals fans, I'm sure a lot of Bengals players, coaches, even non-coaches, some of the guys that are no longer on the staff. I know I was thinking about it on Saturday and Sunday, like, man, what if they had just gotten in? You know, they are clearly better than some of these teams that made the playoffs. But when you don't handle business, I'm not blaming anyone else but them. When you don't handle your business, it doesn't matter if you're better. It matters what your record is. And so it's twofold there. It's like, what if they had just found a way to win one more game? Mm-hmm. At the same time, they got to win one more game, and they have no one to blame but the team in the mirror.
Yeah, there are obviously many individual plays and players and moments that we've talked about throughout the season. And that's part of the what if too, right? The game that we've been playing with this season all along. It's just refreshed. The scab torn off. I think it reopens the wound a little bit when you watch some of these games and you see these teams that don't seem to belong in the playoffs. And maybe, if the Bengals sneak in as a 7 seed, maybe the Bills boat race the Bengals too, right? I think that Joe Burrow's offense is doing a whole lot more than the Bo Nix offense did against the Bills. Maybe the Bengals defense doesn't hold up to the Bills, just like the Broncos defense, which is a good defense, didn't hold up to the Bills and Josh Allen, 31-7 in that game. Sure. But there are opportunities throughout this season for us to say then, what if the defense was just average? And instead of one of the worst in the NFL too often, what if they could play a complete game against the Chargers, against the Ravens, where they played one half of stopping football in those games and it just wasn't enough? Or if the offense had been able to capitalize on those halves where the defense did do enough, and the lack of complementary football all year, what if the Bengals had gotten a little bit more complementary football and it managed to be a 6 seed or a 5 seed and had an opportunity to play one of these teams that they either have had close games with already this year in the Chargers and the Ravens, and both of those games they had opportunities to win, or even if they had managed to beat the Chargers in that game and also beat the Ravens in one of those 2 games. And then maybe you're talking about an AFC champion team or AFC North champion team and a home game. And close to it, right? And they didn't do it. And so it just reopens those what if questions in a big way for me when I watched a lot of these AFC games this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, if they had won 2, let's say Patriots Chiefs. Well, now we're talking or Patriots Chargers. We're talking about going to Houston. And I can promise you the result wouldn't have been what that result was. I mean, that was just awful.
That's a Justin Herbert meltdown right there.
And Burrow doesn't melt down. He's never melted down.
Not like that.
You mentioned, and not like that on the big stage. You mentioned the possibility of the Bills blowing out the Bengals. The Bengals haven't gotten blown out this year. There's one time against the Eagles. That's it. And even when it almost got away from them against the Steelers, they rallied and had a shot there. And so it's a bunch of what ifs. In a season full of what ifs, the wild card round of the playoffs happens. And I would pick that. Let's say the Bengals got together right now and played in the Walmart parking lot against these other teams, like Travis Kelce mentioned, and they had to play the Chargers. I'd pick the Bengals. And they had to play, I'll throw the Texans in there. I would pick the Bengals. And they had to play the Steelers or the Broncos. They just beat those teams in the past couple of weeks. If you don't like it, whatever, I would still pick the Bengals. And that's what's infuriating about this team is you didn't have to play your best ball in September. You just had to play ball in September. You just had to get 2 wins in September, and we're having a different conversation, and you're having a shot at it. And also the other thing that I think is really important to hammer home here, this idea that the Bills would have loved and would have rather, and I got on a Twitter debate. Who was it? It was with one of those former Chiefs linemen. I forget his name. That's always on Twitter. But I got into a debate last week. Like, yeah, the Bills wouldn't have wanted to see the Bengals. Of course, they would much rather see the Denver Broncos. That point is proven. A lot of people listening, watching, shared that, I believe, shared that view. It's not like I was original in that take. I think that point was hammered home and proven for sure.
Yeah, it was one of the Schwartzes. I'm sure.
Schwartz. Yeah, one of the Schwartzes, yes.
There was a big narrative last week, of course, that Joe Burrow in the playoffs would have been a lot of fun. Absolutely true. And then there's this counter narrative that is nobody's scared of the Bengals. This team can't beat anybody that's won a game. And meanwhile, there's a bunch of people calling the Ravens the hottest team in football right now. And the Ravens have beaten the Giants, the Steelers, the Texans, and the Browns to be the hottest team in football going into the playoffs. And so I don't know how you can separate those two things. If you're calling the Ravens the hottest team in football and you're saying nobody should be afraid of the Bengals, and you're citing the quality of the teams the Bengals have beaten in their win streak to finish the season, but somehow the Ravens win streak is better, I guess because it included the Steelers, who are technically a playoff team, and the Texans, who just won a playoff game, both of whom
Texans,
I would argue, are relatively fraudulent as far as the true contender conversation goes. And you know this about me, James. My threshold for quote unquote good NFL team is like the best 4 teams in the NFL.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't think that there are necessarily a bunch of good teams left in the playoffs when we look at it. So a lot of what ifs that you can talk about that way, but that's part of what the Bengals have to take away from this season. You don't want to be in the situation where you're looking at the wild card round and you're thinking, man, we could have won that game. You never want to be there again. And so you have to look in the mirror and not only self-scout, but also take away some lessons from these teams that had success in the playoffs. On both sides, the AFC and NFC. Obviously, the focus on the AFC, where I would expect the Bills and the Ravens and the Chargers and the Texans, I would expect all those teams to be around. Despite what I think about some of those teams this year, they're probably in the playoff conversation again next year.
Sure.
Probably more of what you have to deal with. So when you're thinking about your future, you also always, every year, I think, can take away lessons from these playoff games. And we'll continue to watch this throughout the playoffs. Let's talk about some of those lessons the Bengals can take away coming up next. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes,
Was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert that will find every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
James, as you were watching Wild Card Weekend, what were your biggest takeaways? Were there themes that you noticed? I'll talk about some of the things I noticed as well. I'm going to talk about Joe Brady at some point here too, because I think the Bills and Joe Brady are a little bit fascinating to discuss here, especially as it pertains to Joe Burrow specifically. But as you watch these games on the whole, what were some of the big takeaways from you that could be lessons learned for the Cincinnati Bengals as they think about 2025?
Do you think Lamar Jackson's going to win MVP?
I do think Lamar Jackson is
Okay.
heavily favored to win MVP.
If not, it'll be Josh Allen, right?
I mean, the all-pro voting always lines up with the MVP.
Okay. No, the reason I'm bringing it up is because both of those teams ran the crap out of the ball and really leaned on the run game. The Ravens ran it 15 straight times against the rough and tough Steelers that have this identity. The Steelers, rough and tough. Not true. Soft and not tough. Good Lord. Anyways, I don't want to hear that when your division rival runs it through you 15 straight times. That's what Lamar and the Ravens did with Derrick Henry. And it worked. Obviously, it worked. They're racking up 300 rushing yards. Meanwhile, the Bills, it was kind of Bengals-esque. They were moving the ball consistently, and they had to settle for field goals in the red zone. And we've seen that from the Bengals at times. And Josh Allen makes this wild throw to Ty Johnson, who makes the best catch probably of the playoffs. We'll see, but certainly of the first round, the wild card round. And that breaks the game open a bit. But they were relying on the run game as well. And they have. I mean, James Cook, I think, finished with 16 touchdowns. But the thing that I think relates to the Bengals, we know Joe's awesome. We know Jamar and hopefully T, awesome. Chase Brown has taken a step. You hope he takes another step. But it is nice when things get stagnant or you're getting stopped in the red zone or you're trying to put a game away or maybe you're trying to start by not letting Lamar and the Ravens take control of the game. It's nice to have a run game to lean on at times. And I think the Bills and the Ravens and even the Chiefs, which we didn't see this weekend, but we'll see them this coming week, they can lean on the run game. Throw Houston in there as well. They did in that weird, wacky, wild game. They were able to lean on the run down the stretch.
Yeah, it's not that we're advocating, and I don't think this is your point, and I'll let you clarify it, that the Bengals take the ball out of Joe Burrow's hands. Nobody is asking for that, especially James Rapien. If you've ever listened to this show before, you know that is not what James is saying. But you look at the results, and we're recording this before the Rams have played the Vikings. That game moved to Monday night. So we have 5 wild card games in the books. 4 out of the 5 wild card victors ran the ball more than they threw the ball, and most of those significantly so. The Eagles ran the ball 34 times to 21 passes for Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts was sacked a couple of times. I'm sure he scrambled a couple of times, but you get the idea. That's a significant split. The closest was the Texans, who ran the ball just one more time, which includes kneel downs. So they probably had, not including kneel downs, I think there were kneel downs in that game, more passing attempts and rushing attempts, but technically finished with more rushes and passes. Another one that's very close, but an exception, the Commanders have 35 attempts to 33 rushes. The Ravens, though, 50 rushes in that game to 21 passes for Lamar Jackson. The Bills, 26 passes for Josh Allen, 44 rushes for the team, including 8 Josh Allen rushes, and the Ravens had, of course, 15 Lamar Jackson rushes sprinkled in there. So the point here is, while those quarterbacks passed the ball really well, Josh Allen's passing line is awesome in this game, and his contributions as a runner were critical. Lamar Jackson's impact as a runner, obviously critical. His passing line, hyper efficient, 16 for 21, 2 touchdowns, 175. But, and we've talked about this plenty, this isn't something new, this isn't novel, this is throughout the history of football, You have to be able to run the ball to finish games, especially in the playoffs. And we saw a lot of these teams have a lot of success with that, including the Texans in a big way, where you talk about the Ravens running the ball down the Steelers. So it's the Texans able to finish off that game with a significant running drive featuring a lot of Joe Mixon that a lot of Bengals fans are very aware of and are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the Bengals can take away from this, especially the Bills example, is where I want to go next, is that even though you have that guy at quarterback, as you started this segment, a couple of MVP candidates there with the biggest split of significantly more running plays than passing plays for those teams in these playoffs. You have to be able to run the ball the way the NFL is going right now. It needs to be something you're competent at to be a complete offense. You need to be at least competent. And that's not exactly where the Bengals are right now. They're very inconsistent with it. And when the defense knows it's coming, the Bengals are getting like 2 yards a pop. They're not running the ball to finish games this year the way they did 2 years ago in 2022, which is the last time I think they were able to do it with any bit of regularity.
Yeah, I think they blow out the Steelers if they could have ran the ball effectively. They had a 2-score lead. Like a lot of these games that finished where it's like down to the wire, the Broncos, I think they're able to control it a bit more after they had seized control of the game and end it. And so it's not just in games they lose and losses where we look at it. It's like, man, these close wins that they had down the stretch might not have needed to be that close.
Those Ravens games, if they're able to run the ball, maybe you're not throwing a pick on a slant to Marlon Humphrey in that first Ravens game.
In that first Ravens game, after Lamar lets the ball go through his hands, you get the ball. Maybe running the ball gets you closer than 53 yards. Maybe it leads to an explosive game-ending touchdown. You just never know. And so, yeah, I think that element of it, you're going to talk about the scheme part, I think. That's why you mentioned Joe Brady. But the personnel, the guards, you need some guys that are going to be able to run through guys and really be these tough physical blockers, regardless of who you're playing. Baltimore didn't care. Baltimore didn't care that they were playing Pittsburgh and this rough and tough Steelers team. No, they didn't care. They were like, all right, well, we're going to run the ball and you're not going to have an answer. And Lamar's a big part of that. There's no doubt. But the Bills are going to see the Ravens this week. Do we have any doubt that both of those teams are going to try to run the ball? Of course they are. It doesn't mean that Lamar and Josh, they're not going to have to go win it. But having that would help for sure. And so I think there's a scheme element and there's certainly a personnel element. Both need to be addressed in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Yeah, it's not just one or the other. It's getting guys that are able to physically displace in the run game and it's marrying up your scheme to your passing game. And that's what Joe Brady has done so well. The reason that, back after the Pittsburgh game, for example, when there was a lot more, the Pittsburgh loss, when there's a lot more like, fire everybody, blow it up. And people are talking about Ben Johnson. People are talking about Joe Brady at the time. I'm kind of thinking like, is there actually a fit between Ben Johnson and Joe Burrow? And then if it's Joe Brady, why would that be any different? Wouldn't that just be the same Joe Burrow offense that we've seen him be so successful in going back to LSU, where he and Joe Brady were together? The answer to that question is actually no. The reason that Joe Brady and the Bills have been so successful since they let Ken Dorsey go last year is the willingness to marry the pass game to the run game. Obviously, they have a huge schematic advantage because those quarterbacks exist and they can run a read option with those guys, or those guys can be such a part of your running game that you have to account for them. And Joe Burrow is a good scrambler, but he's not those guys as a runner. So you're not going to have a significant read option game as part of your development in the Bengals offense. But you could look at the Bills and see what they're doing with the extra lineman stuff in their run game and going under center with Josh Allen and incorporating that into their pass game as well, and having those things married so well together. And that's where I'm really impressed with Joe Brady, is that he went from the guy that put Joe Burrow in this situation, getting guys into the pattern, really setting the groundwork for the Joe Burrow offense that we see today. And then you watch that game and you watch the Bills this year, and they're doing so much. They're leading the league in extra lineman sets, and they're getting explosive passing plays off of heavy extra lineman sets because they're building the pass game and the run game in such great synchronicity, if that's a word.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is a word. And if not, it is now official word of Locked On Bengals. I have one thought on that when you talk about Joe Brady, And then we have to get to a familiar face as well. But my final thought on Joe Brady coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is the app you need. Download it right now, literally right now. Unless you're driving, of course, wait until you're done driving. But if you love going to live events, and you do, I guarantee you do, whether it's sports, music, theater, comedy, Gametime is going to help you get there. And it's just going to make the entire process easier. It's going to save you money. It's going to be convenient. It's going to be easy to use. And they've made it so easy with their new Gametime Picks feature. This feature filters out all of the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDONNFL with the Gametime app. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. Locked on NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right, Jake. As far as Joe Brady is concerned, that's something that in the back of my mind, and I've thought about this for the past week, probably about week. I was going to say week or two, but the season's been over for a week, and I didn't really let my brain get there. Obviously, the Bengals are keeping Zach Taylor. But if you're a Bengals fan, you want Joe Brady to stay put this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Just wait one more cycle, just in case. Just in case things don't go right. You want that option available. You don't want him to get a head coaching job now. And I'm sorry, Joe. I'm not rooting against you, Mr. Joe Brady. I don't know you, never met you. But it would be nice to have that option as a possibility with Joe and Jamar and whoever else could potentially be on the roster next year that knows Joe Brady.
I have come to a point where I think I fully agree with that. Of course, this can change over time. There was a period of skepticism with Joe Brady when he transitioned to the NFL, but I think that his ability to adapt and incorporate new ideas and evolve his offense that we've seen in Buffalo, and like I said, really the willingness to marry and lean into the run game and incorporate that with the pass game and really integrate those things, which is something that we've been talking about with the Bengals for years now. Hopefully the transition to a new offensive line coach gives Zach Taylor, Dan Pitcher the opportunity to embrace and get on the same page and do the same thing. It's been really impressive for Joe Brady and is part of the reason that I've really changed my tune thinking about Joe Brady's ability as a coach. I think he's every bit living up to the kind of prodigy label he got all those years ago.
And by the way, maybe Zach and Dan with new personnel and new offensive, maybe it all comes together and it doesn't matter, right? But it's always good to have options. It just is. And so that would be the one thing is it's like, yeah, let's wait a year, Mr. Joe Brady, just in case. That's all. It's
an interesting thought, but I think ideally, given the reality that we live in, that we see the Bengals transition to that world where the new offensive line coach and run game coordinator is just a perfect fit for what Joe Burrow wants to do, what Zach and Dan Pitcher want to do, and they get that thing synced up in Cincinnati. Now, you're talking about options and the luxury of options.
Talking about options.
Sounds like
options.
Mike Zimmer.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and you're talking about options. Oh, that was practice. Go ahead.
If you're interested in Mike Zimmer as a DC and a reunion in Cincinnati with the Bengals having that job still open, I actually have a bit of a hard time making a case for Zimmer looking at his most recent results, both as head coach in Minnesota and his 1 year in Dallas. But I would be remiss, I think, to totally dismiss the idea. What are your thoughts, James?
Yeah, I think he's still a good coach. Obviously, personnel matters always. It was a weird year in Dallas. I was looking at the numbers. A lot of them would be negative. I could look at turnovers as positive. I could say middle of the road in some categories. Like, it just depends on what you want to look at. Ultimately, though, it's like, all right, well, what about the fit? And I think the reason why they didn't jump at, not that they haven't kicked the tires on, but they didn't jump at Dennis Allen, right? Or some of these veteran coaches. Not that they aren't interested. There might be some interest there in Matt Eberflus and some guys, but fit. They want the right fit. And I just wonder, I don't know the answer to this. Would Mike Zimmer, a known for his toughness, non-sugarcoating, being very clear, direct, and I think tough personality with players in a good way, right? He's trying to get the most out of them, but that's what he's known for. Is that what they're looking for at 68 years old and what was in Dallas for 1 year and then was consulting for a few years after losing that Vikings head coaching job? I don't know. I don't know how it would fit. What I do think, though, Jake, he's still well respected in the building. A lot of people in that building still hold him in high regard, and so I'm not willing to just dismiss it. But I'm not sure that he was ever on Zach Taylor's short list. Not saying that he isn't, but I would lean toward him not being on it. Like if you had to have me guess Zach Taylor's short list, I'm not sure Mike Zimmer would be on it. He might be on Mike Brown's, might be on the front offices, and so I do think that's interesting too. But I would be sort of surprised, I think, because of the fit. I'm not sure that they would view him as a fit.
Yeah, and at this point, I don't think, given the decision to keep Zach Taylor and move on from other coaches, that this is an instance where the front office is going to put their thumb on the scale and say, we're going to hire Mike Zimmer. If you're going to keep Zach Taylor and you're going to make the choice to believe in Zach Taylor, you got to let Zach bring in the coaching staff that he wants and ride or die with that coaching staff. Crash and burn or win the race. You know, whatever.
Which is why Joe Brady needs to wait.
Yeah.
Wait, Joe.
Well, as a contingency plan, right? But the other thing with Zimmer that I think is interesting is, I mean, unless you just want to waste a year, which I don't think any of us are interested in.
No.
You know, you got to still try to win in 25. The other thing with Zimmer that I think is challenging is you just look at the recent results. And in 2024, running the Dallas defense, they gave up the second most points per game in the NFL. His last couple of years in Minnesota, it wasn't so good either. It was like the 10th worst scoring defense in the NFL in 2021, his last season. In Minnesota, the third worst yardage defense. In 2020, it was the fourth worst points per game defense in the NFL. And again, one of the worst yards per game defenses in the NFL, the sixth worst yards per game defense in the NFL. Go back to 2019, that's the last time Mike Zimmer's team fielded a great defense. They were a top 5 scoring defense in the NFL, really good that year. And as far as yards per game, again, a relatively top unit, giving up more yards per game than points per game in terms of rankings. But it's been a while since he produced, or his defense produced, like a statistically excellent year. And so that would be another reason. In addition to, I think, in your perspective is the right one, the primary fit-based reasons, I would take a little bit of pause and say, how is Mike Zimmer doing in terms of keeping up? And I would have to dig into this. How is he doing with keeping up with the current trends around the NFL? Because I think he's still doing a lot of the same things with probably some changes that he was doing when he last produced good defenses. And obviously the game changes considerably over time.
Yeah, I will say missing his 2 starting corners, Micah Parsons missed time, Lawrence missed time. You know, like you're talking about his 4 best defensive players now. Mm-hmm. And so just to give context, because the stats are ugly.
And one of the things that we're talking about in Cincinnati is being able to get the most out of players, even when there are injuries and you don't have the guys, right? So that's part of the job too.
Sure, no doubt. And those 4 guys are better than everyone but Trey on the Bengals defense. All 4, you know, so it's just tough. That's all. So I think he could still coach. I don't think it will necessarily be here. Put it that way.
It's an interesting thought nonetheless.
Yeah, it is. I think 3 years ago or 2 years ago, it might have been different. It's just right now, I do think that it's going to be up to Zach. Zach doesn't know Mike Zimmer from Adam, right? Why would he know Mike Zimmer? You know, they might have coached against each other when Zach was in Miami. When Zach was in Miami and Mike was either with the Bengals or with the Vikings. Yeah. You know, obviously they coached against each other this year, technically, as head coach versus defensive coordinator. But the point is it's not like you're talking to every defensive coordinator when you're the head coach of the other team a bunch. So they've probably said hi and met each other a few times, but I'm not sure that there's necessarily a relationship there, which is a factor when you're looking at, all right, who am I going to hire, especially if it's a veteran coach that's 68 years old, that's done it for a long time. You should probably know that guy at least a little bit if you're going to go that route versus young upstart guy or insert whoever. This is it to me. This Mike Zimmer's in a different tier than the Matt Eberflus's or the Robert Salehs or the other NFL head coaches or former NFL head coaches that might end up as defensive coordinators.
Yeah, we'll see where Mike ends up. Maybe he follows Dion to wherever the Sanders family lands in the NFL.
Ooh. Maybe he comes here.
Cheek.
I don't want to completely dismiss it because there's a chance. There's a chance.
Yeah, we don't have any new information today. On that note, we're talking about Mike Zimmer because he becomes available with the Dallas decision to let Mike McCarthy look for greener pastures, and we'll see if he finds them. But the reason we talk about Mike Zimmer is because he becomes apparently available in a time where the Bengals haven't had much news around their defensive coordinator search since the Matt Eberflus news, and we'll continue to keep our eyes and ears open. And as we have information that we can share, we will certainly share it with you and share our perspective on those things. When they make a DC hire or an offensive line coach hire, we'll make sure that we have done our history checks and our due diligence there, as well as we bring you the analysis of those hires as well. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.